The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. I'm Niresh Eliyatambi. My guest tonight is Asela Waidyalankara, cyber security professional and policy advocate. Welcome, Asela, back to this show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you're a cyber security professional and we have an election coming. Probably two elections.
Two elections, yes.
We don't really know which one first. There's a lot of speculation. Maybe the presidential, maybe the parliamentary. But as we have seen with elections in many countries in recent times, social media and the internet are playing an enormous role in determining the election result by swaying the voters. Now, you can sway the voters in many ways by telling the truth. In the old days, it was the newspapers or the radio and then television. Now, anyone can get on the net and say what they want. Could be the truth, could be untruths, could be calculated strategies. And we have seen this in several elections.
Indeed.
Possibly one or two of our own in Sri Lanka, but certainly in the Western world. And there are actually companies which specialize in this misinformation strategies. Now, how prepared are we to face this kind of situation in the upcoming election?
Bit of a long question, but first of all, again, thank you for having me. An interesting topic that you threw me to. But let me just give you a background. This is probably not only Sri Lanka. There's a lot of democracies within this year that's having elections. In fact, it's known as a very impactful year for elections. I think half of the globe is going to the polls this year.
More people will be voting this year than in any other year in history.
And it will be very impactful in terms of global politics as well. You have the US elections, you have the Indian elections, the Indonesian, the Brazilian. So there are so many elections right now, and it's a very interesting time for elections because of what's happening in the geopolitical front, what's happening in the economic front, and probably the outcome of these elections will determine what trajectory those countries take in terms of policy. So outcome-wise, it's a very important election. And then, of course, when it comes to Sri Lanka, again, probably the destiny of the country also perhaps will be decided, perhaps in some of these elections that you mentioned. If you permit me to give a little background on what Sri Lanka's environment is right now when it comes to the internet and digital. Sri Lanka has about touch under 22 million in terms of population. And out of that population, stats-wise, I think as far as the January 2024 stats go, we have about 12 million people who are online. Now, out of the 12 million, there are about 7.5 million who use social media. So that's a sizable chunk. And if you take the demographic breakdown, most of them, and if you take the voting population, most of the 18 to 30 block is mostly on social media. So why is that important? Their main tool for information consumption comes from social media, not the traditional media. So they don't read, perhaps like you and I, they don't read the newspapers, they don't watch television in that sense, they don't watch programs in that sense because they want it more personalized. Therefore, their main tool for consumption of information becomes social media. And unfortunately, that means you are at the mercy of some of these algorithms. That can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing as well. The good thing is it will give you very personalized recommendations, it will show you what you exactly agree with, your preferences. The bad thing is exactly what I said, because then you will be entrenched in your views, whether right or wrong. And unfortunately, the algorithm will keep feeding you those views. And what we've seen is sometimes you tend to become very extreme in those views because obviously you've been reinforced. So this is the kind of background that we're facing. And now if you see, even in the US or any other country, there is a lot of polarization in society. And we see this even now, especially on social media, when it comes to things they believe in, the party they believe in, or the leader they support. There is a lot of polarization. So we are having less discussion, less agreement on common themes, more entrenched and more extreme views, because that is what is being fed to us. And therefore, on a democratic front, more than anything else, because democracy is about common ideas, exchange of ideas, ideals,
yes.
and reaching common ground. You may agree with something, I may agree with something. We have different views, but let's agree on A, B, and C. That is the bedrock of democracy. So this is why some of us are a little concerned about these algorithms and the disproportionate impact they have in society, and actually sort of eroding the fabric of democracy. So I think in that aspect, we should look at it when we're talking about elections and all that. So I'll give you just the opening.
So when you speak of algorithms, from a layman's perspective, what it means is that the machines are watching what you are looking at. So if I were to, when I'm scrolling up and down, if I keep stopping at pictures of roses, the algorithm would pick up on that and would feed me with a lot more pictures of roses.
Exactly. Same thing, for example, let's say YouTube. You watch videos of roses. Most likely, the next recommended video will be of roses, or will be something connected to roses, perhaps gardening. So it keeps on branching out on similar topics because it understands, but of course there's a lot more involved, but I'm just simplifying the process. But it will guide you through a certain information trajectory, and that's probably the good and the bad of it.
So that's sound marketing, but when it comes to general knowledge, exchange of ideas, politics, it's not exactly the best way. Perhaps. For example, let's take Mr. Donald Trump. If you keep stopping at videos of Mr. Trump, the algorithm will keep feeding you more of Mr. Trump and less of Mr. Biden.
Absolutely.
So then...
and if I may interrupt you, it is not only Mr. Trump, because there is a set of ideals that Mr. Trump endorses. So, for example, it may think that you're pro-gun in terms of US. So it will throw you pro-gun content. It may consider you anti-immigration. So it will keep throwing you anti-immigration. So what I'm trying to say is not only just Trump videos. I mean, that we can probably say, okay, I like Trump and I get more Trump videos. No, it will understand the underlying themes behind that and continue to push you down that rabbit hole. And that's the danger.
But this isn't good for democracy, is it?
Absolutely not.
Because essentially, we've got machines determining what we'll have in front of us to look at.
In our rectangular screens.
Exactly. So that's rather disturbing. But it's not new. It's been happening for perhaps a decade or more. Now, let's look at how this process can be hijacked by political parties or even foreign entities. If a foreign government wishes to meddle in an election, the example being when Mr. Trump won, there were many allegations that there were companies based in Russia which had helped him win in some way. These are, of course, allegations. But now, that was perhaps 8 years ago. I would assume that technology has moved forward a lot more. So
Light
it would
years.
be light years. Yeah. So it would be much more sophisticated. And do we know? Can we predict what's going to happen? What form these online strategies would take?
So one interesting development from the last time Mr. Trump was in an election versus now is, and I'm sure this is the buzzword everyone's talking about, is AI. Now, because of AI, in terms of the election space, one of the bad things that can happen is the quality of the misinformation or disinformation can go high, because volume-wise as well as quality-wise, you will have better things coming out because of AI. Then you can have at scale, infinite scale. That is the dangerous part, because now if you look at things like bots, there were constraints on those things. Maybe the resources you had, maybe let's say the amount of machines you had, or the amount of operators you had. But with AI, you're looking at infinite scale in terms of these operations, or we call it influence operations. The key terminology is influence operations, but yes, I agree. And are we in a position to even monitor that? Even these companies, you made a very pertinent point. These companies are not state entities. They're actually private companies, although they're based in, let's say, United States or the West. They are companies that are a law unto their own, and we see how hard these companies are to even regulate on. There's a lot of pushback from them, even at Congress. However, to its credit, the US Congress, they've done a bit of work to make sure that they are compliant on these things. But imagine that with AI steroids. So I think that is what we have to be conscious of. And especially, I go back to the point I made. So the way you consume information, if it's primarily on social media, and it's primarily driven by content that is in front of you or pushed through you from an algorithm that is centered around a social media. And it could be anything. It could be YouTube, it could be Facebook, it could be any other social media platform you use. But the problem is, then you are not in control, because then you are not making informed decisions. The decision, you're being, gently tugged towards a different side. And that is where these, what we call filter bubbles, come in, where you are in your own bubble, you only agree with people in that bubble.
Yes.
And anyone outside that bubble you completely disagree with. You look at them sometimes even militantly, because they don't agree with you. And fundamentally, this is where I think most democracies are having an issue, because people don't talk anymore. People agree on a set of things, and then they fight everyone else, believing what they believe is correct. And I think that violates the fundamental tenet of democracy. Because the whole idea was that I may not agree with you, I can sit in a room with you, and I can have a civil discussion. And maybe I may see a side of you, what you're saying that I didn't know before. You may see a side of what I say, probably you didn't realize before, and maybe you realize we're not too different after all. And we can agree on some things. Now, Pew Research did a research, I think, last year, and they found Americans are more and more entrenched in their views, so much so that, Democrat, Republican, that there is no middle ground anymore. They've really shifted to each extreme. So much so that, there was a fun little study done that people who are Democrats don't want to even date Republicans now. And actually, they had to create apps for, just to show that you're from one party and you date within that party. What does that tell you? That you're not open. You're not willing to listen to those other ideas. And this is the danger.
Well, that's quite interesting. And so the world is becoming more polarized, less open for debate, and that is certainly not a good thing.
Not a great thing for democracy.
Right. And at the same time, social media, AI, because it's growing in volume and it's ever present, it tends to drown out the real world as well. For example, if you go in a bus or a train, before the days of smartphones, people would be looking at each other or looking out the window and seeing what's going on outside. But now, about 90% of people on a bus are looking at their smartphones. So,
The question you should ask is why?
I mean,
Because-
a dinosaur could walk past the bus, they wouldn't notice. They'd be on their phones.
I'll tell you an interesting story actually. We were at one point with my family at Yala, and there was this giant elephant that was right in front of us, and my daughter completely mixed it because she was on her phone. So, and I'll tell you why. Because they're very good at showing us what we like, what we're good at, what we're interested in. And they've harvested our attention, and that's why some people have classified it as the attention economy, where you are actually, you pay for the eyeballs.
Right.
And because of that, because they're so good, and I'll give you an example, and I'll give you why it's so addictive, if I can use that word. This came out when Cambridge Analytica investigations came out at the time, so you can imagine how much more it would have matured. At that time, Facebook had 8,800 data points on you. Now, what is a data point? Age, sex, location, device, the OS that you use, everything. So 8,800 of that. So
Right.
can you imagine the level of granularity of how much they know about you? And at one testimony, I think it was at the US Congress, they said Facebook probably knows more about you than your parents, because it made it a science to understand who you are. Because you're the product, and we always keep saying this. I mean, if something is free, you're the product. The fact that all these social media platforms are free to use, just your data. But the fact is that you are there and you're using it and you're giving your attention is what they count on, because that's their business model. 90% of all the companies, be it Facebook now, Meta, 90 or 95% of their revenue is advertising. Advertising means, let's say I want 500,000 people who like dogs, they will give you exactly that.
Right. So let's get to advertising in a minute. Let's take a short break and we'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
TV1. TV for life.
Prime Minister Dinesh Gunawardena holds talks on blue economy with China, while Sagala Ratnayaka explores land connectivity with India. President's delegation holds serious talks ahead of the conclusion of the government's tenure. Multiple factions cite election as a solution. Will the UNP and the SJB unite? Ruwan passes hints, says ready to take on the challenge of UNP leadership. Namal is incapable to take up the role of presidency. Ranil is a suitable candidate, SLPP MP Dolavatta says. Karuna forms Aman force, will support Ranil at presidential election. Inflation drops to 0.9% in March. Police seize 100 million rupees in underworld assets.
TV1. TV for life.
The Colombo Wind Orchestra presents their annual concert, Music from Around the World, a captivating musical experience conducted by Keiko Kobayashi, featuring a delightful selection of music spanning various genres and composers. 2nd of April, 7 p.m. onwards at the Lionel Wen Theatre. Electronic media sponsors Yes 101, Legends 966 and TV1. Print media, Sunday Times and Daily Mirror.
ජීවිතේ දිනන්න අපි හැමෝම ලොකු තරඟයක. හැබැයි දෙහිඅත්ත කණ්ඩිය පුස්සලවින්න ගම්මුන්ට මේ තරඟය තවත් අපහසුයි. වැඩිහිටියන්ට විතරක් නෙවෙයි දරුවන්ටත්. දවස ඉක්මන් කරගන්න අවදානම ගැන හිතන්න නැතුව මේ ලීදඬු පාලමෙන් එතර වෙන්න ඕන. ගම්මුන්ගේ හිත හරි හයියයි. ඒ හිතේ හයියට වටිනම තෑග්ග. ගම්මැද්දෙන් අලුත් පාලමක්. විවෘත වෙන්නේ මේ 30 වෙනිදා.
Singharaja, Sri Lanka's precious world heritage. The People's Platform.
Welcome back to the People's Platform. My guest is Asela Waidyalankara, cyber security professional and policy advocate. So, Asela, a lot of interesting points that you made. And let's look at the last point, which was advertising. Now, a couple of decades ago, when an election came along, politicians rustled up a lot of money, goodness knows from where, and they bought advertising in newspapers, on the radio, posters on walls, television, all that. But now it's not just about straight up advertising. There's a lot more which can be done in perhaps an insidious fashion. So you could hire one of these private companies in another country, which is proven
With a track record.
With a track record, so you know they're good. They've helped some other politician in another country get to power. So if you have the money, you would possibly hire them. If you have the money and no scruples. How much does this cost? Is it in millions of dollars, billions of dollars? Well, because social media, the internet, it's a huge world. I mean, there is a reason why people like Bill Gates became the world's wealthiest man, Elon Musk, and so on. What are we talking here? Can local politicians in a country like Sri Lanka afford that?
I'm told sometimes it's the upwards of $1 million. Sometimes. But actually, no. Like you said, there are companies out there very much specialized in this space. However, you know, if you know the tools and use the tools well, and one aspect we didn't touch upon is misinformation and disinformation. Now, misinformation is you are mistakenly sharing something, but disinformation, like you very correctly said, is insidious. It may make an opponent look bad. And this is where again AI can come in. Now it can make you say something you never did, be in places that you never were, be in very compromising positions, and the digital literacy of the people is such that there will be a sizable population that will believe it as gospel. That is the issue. Of course, if you're a little more younger and you're a little more savvy on these things, you may believe it, and you may rather not believe it, and you will question it. But even now today, there was a research that came out, even older Americans, whatever is on Facebook, even if it's AI-generated images, they tend to believe it as truth. So can you imagine, in an election, and especially we see it now happening at scale in India, and I suppose that will be the same sort of template that will be used in Sri Lanka. So you can rely on local talent, per se, to actually execute some of these operations. And we know that there is an ecosystem now that is built around that. There is an ecosystem that will weaponize some of these things. The memes you see, the jokes you see, and the videos you get that are sort of funny, that pokes fun at an individual or a politician, those are not just made by individuals who are just doing it for fun. There is an entire economy that runs on this, and I call it the influence economy, because their entire business model is to make sure that influence swings a certain way. So you can elicit these guys. There are people who run pages you can pay, and then information will be positioned in a way. They will not overtly say they are supporting a candidate, but information will be positioned in such a way, and they will layer that into the normal stuff that they share, and then suddenly you yourself will be sort of pushed in that direction.
So it's very psychological.
It's very psychological. It's very psychological, very subtle, and you may not realize it. And I think that's what we have to be conscious of, and I think voters have to be conscious of, because you have to have a high degree of information literacy and a digital literacy to understand and see through some of these things. And unfortunately, we as a policy, we have not invested in making sure the citizenry are equipped with that type of knowledge. I mean, surely one thing that came out of this economic crisis is that our financial literacy is not that great as citizens. I think it's somewhere like 30%, 35%, it might be higher. Although our literacy is in the high 90s, which is the ability to read and write. So digital literacy is the same. I think it's about 60% right now, but it's concentrated around urban areas. So you have to understand in that backdrop, when something is there on social media, when somebody sees on social media, it's very difficult to, unless you know these things and how these things work, to distill that thing and to understand it for what it is. Because as far as you know, you may make a decision on it. And I'll tell you another example, and this is something our policymakers have completely missed. Now, you in the media as professionals, you have a cool-off period. I believe it's 3 days after, campaigning ends and the polling starts. There's a cooling off period of 3 days, if I'm not mistaken, as per election law. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Now, that doesn't apply to social media. Social media can go on until you cast the ballot on that poll. So you have to understand its influence extends beyond the traditional methods that we consume information, and this is where it's dangerous, because we have not really thought of it that way. Now, even right now, Election Commission will give directives to official, let's say, Facebook pages, official social media handles. But what about what I told you, these information merchants who operate in the background? They are continuing. It's a 24/7 operation. The memes continue. The videos continue. Suddenly, just before the vote, there might be an AI-generated video that comes out that may look like one candidate is doing something criminal, for all you know. And that could actually swing 100,000, 200,000 people. And in election this close, maybe that would be the wafer thin margin you need to win. And I'll give you one example. This is very good documented. It was done in Africa. So one of these companies actually went in and it realized that it was a close race. So what it did was, it realized that it couldn't convince a young vote block of 18 to 21 to vote for that particular candidate that had, contracted them. And what they did was they planted an operation in a way that convinced the younger people not to vote, to boycott the vote. And what happened was, you actually took that block away, and thereby that candidate won. So what you must understand is, these are not straightforward things. It's very cloak and dagger, very thought out, very layered, and very subtly done operation. So when you are consuming information, and that's what I urge everyone, especially, we love to share things on WhatsApp, forward things on WhatsApp. What you must understand is, you are perpetuating maybe a more advanced information influence operation than you may think.
And in the elections which are coming up in Sri Lanka, we have many candidates for president. We have many political parties all jockeying for position, and no one is really sure of who's going to win right now because we don't have a very good polling system.
Like the US, where you have exit polls and the data is better.
Exactly. So, in that sense, social media would play an even bigger role than it would normally do.
At least now, even now, people consider it a litmus test. So people look at, and that's probably the danger, because you can inflate influence in social media because the way the technology works. See, you may have 100 profiles right now under you, under your direct control, and that 100 profiles may perpetuate a certain point of view which people may believe this is what the masses are saying. And I think we have to be conscious of those things. And especially the citizens, when they're making their valid, the really precious and valid vote, when they're casting it, you have to be sure that it's done in a correct frame of mind. Because like you correctly said, it could be local, it could be foreign. There are many parties jockeying for interests in the country, the outcome of the elections. So we have to be cautious of it, because certainly there's no concerted effort to make sure people understand the depth of the problem. But at least what we can advocate is caution.
And on that note, I'm afraid we are out of time. My thanks to Asela Waidyalankara, my guest tonight. Thank you very much for coming on the show once again. And thank you for watching. Have a good night.